Hi, this is the Just Roommates Writing Queer Romance panel. We'll be discussing the intricacies of writing queer romance, the ways it can be done well and not so well, and the importance of seeing yourself in writing. We've got three wonderful panelists who are here to offer their experience and insight, and so without any further ado, I will let them all introduce themselves.
Hey, my name is Katie Edwards. I am the author of an urban fantasy series called The Tarot Sequence. I'm very glad to be here, actually. This is one of those panels where, to be honest, I'm hoping to learn as much as I can hopefully contribute.
Excellent. Okay. JR?
Hi, I'm J.R. Hart. I write queer fiction. Most recently, I wrote a book called Getting Off about a bi demisexual character who is just now learning a lot about his identity and his experience and working through some trauma. So I really love queerness in respect to romance and in terms of character identity.
Awesome. Okay. Quillful?
All right. I actually is my mic working?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, sorry. It doesn't do the outline.
Yeah,
sorry
it doesn't.
for
I
that.
don't know why it doesn't do that. It's rude.
Weird.
Yeah.
Right? Anyway, I write a lot of queer fiction in different genres. I'm sorry I didn't get to flop the background before we started recording, so use your imagination. But this one here is one of my my stories with my bi main characters. He's just from like a sort of broken home, but it is one of those situations where I try to create a more nuanced and more true to life setup of the interactions between characters, even when I'm delving into fantasy and sci-fi genres. And I think that's really where a lot of my interest comes into this particular subject, because there's just something about the human connection, even if you are dealing with characters who might not technically be entirely human. So that's just something that I think transcends a lot of different genres and should always be the center of everything, especially when you're talking about something like a marginalized community.
Excellent. Okay, that sounds great. Just thinking about which of these questions is best to start with. I'll go with this one. It's the top of the list, and I also think it's a good place to begin. Is there anything you feel that's essential to a successful romance, and do any of these elements differ in queer romance?
Are you directing that to me or Katie?
This is a general question. Anyone can answer at any point.
Okay, well, since I've already started talking, I'm going to continue. So honestly, I would think that with romance in general, a successful romance, the elements can vary whether you're looking at like a dark romance or you're trying to go like pure fluff with it. But either way, I would say there is at least one thing that's always at the center of it, and that's just some sort of magnetism. Whether that magnetism is push or pull is kind of up to the dynamic that you're looking for there. So it's just kind of the key part there, and whether or not you have any external forces at work is another element, but I would say that's an essential part of it to me. For what differs in queer romance, the larger concepts aren't really going to change all that much, which I think is an important thing to mention. Of even like love is love is the kind of cornerstone of a lot of LGBTQ movements, and that's going to persist with things like the essentials of a romance. If you're talking about the things that make it successful, those core things are the same because it's people in love. But of course, there's a whole roster of things that are different for people who are in LGBTQ relationships, especially depending on the setting that you're working with. Even if you're building your own world, you're going to have to ask yourself, well, what are their rights? Can they get married? What's the community they live in? How well will they be received? Are they out? Are they closeted? These are a whole different list of elements that you do need to look at if you're working at a queer romance, because ignoring them would be extremely tactless and very tone deaf overall. So I think those are like things that you can't just kind of skirt around if you're going to try to write a queer romance. It's something it would feel like it was absent, and very noticeably so for the queer community, and most likely so the educated allies as well.
Yeah,
I think it's also interesting when you consider romance in general, and then queer romance is kind of a subset of that. Because overall, with romance, you're looking for that happily ever after. But what that happily ever after might mean for different identities within the LGBTQIA spectrum is very different. So what reflects as happiness, perhaps for an aromantic person in romance, is going to look very different for someone who maybe is asexual but is romantic, or is gay, or something like that. So while there's room for all of those identities in romance, even for identities that might not be romantic necessarily, you still ultimately have to kind of seek that happily ever after and justify that end to your story and keep that identity in mind when doing so.
I think I'd said that this is one of the topics where I'm really interested hearing what the rest of the panelists have to say, mainly because the romantic elements of my story, it's an urban fantasy. There's a premium on a lot of different tentpole concept, the queer community, found family, adventure, action, world building. But the romance is something that I'm approaching from a different point of view from my own experience as a gay man, which is, it's so much better nowadays than it used to be. But it used to be that gay romance equaled erotica. There really weren't many shades between it. So you'd walk into the story and you'd want something, as simple as just that first holding of a hand, that is the romance you want, the sweet romance. And you didn't get it. It jumped right to the hardcore bedroom stuff. And for me, that's not where I am on the queer spectrum. It's not where I am in the queer community. I'm much more along the values of Ace and Demi, that I need my characters to know each other and trust each other. There needs to be consent issues. Building that into my world has been a really satisfying experience. I think the other thing I'd emphasize here, and it's not always possible in the beginning, it certainly wasn't with me, know your audience once you have one. Your audience is looking for certain things. There are genres and subgenres within romance, even queer romance. Make sure you're, if possible, I don't want to say that you always necessarily write exactly what your audience expects, but knowing that if they're looking for that sweet romance, you're not delivering them, something that they wouldn't comfortably read on a subway if someone was looking over their shoulder.
Honestly, I think I'm the youngest bracket where like that was the only gay romance out there for sure. Like I know I can tell you the first gay story that I had ever partaken in, and it was an anime. And if I had seen the intro section on the free version that I was watching, I would have left it immediately. I was not of age to see it. Let's put it that. So in the past, there was no introduction to something like that in queer romance. You didn't get to start with like hand holding and exploring it in a safer, gentler environment either. Like whether I'm Ace as well, but if it's Ace and Aero while we're here, but if you're younger, you're not going to want to start like right on that note. You're going to want to start in like, I'm exploring. I don't want to be like shell shocked out of this. So I think it's a very important thing to mention that there is a nuance and a sort of a shallow end and a deep end for these things.
It's interesting also that there's kind of that note of how it has changed over time, because I do think we're seeing more and more queer fiction and queer romance that showcases more than just that erotica. But you also, I think, have this moment where previously, mostly if you were looking for queer fiction, you were finding gay male fiction. And now you're seeing a lot more sapphic fiction, trans fiction, non-binary fiction than you were, 5 years ago even. And so it's kind of interesting that as times change, you do see more and more of that nuance and more of that identity in fiction than you ever did before.
Absolutely. We have more of that nuance as well on that side. It's fun to see the whole spectrum starting to be included, and more representation from both voices in those communities and allies of those communities. It's beautiful.
Definitely.
I kind of actually want to go a bit further on that idea that for a while there was no, I guess, romantic and only erotic fiction, because I think that's a very interesting topic. I'm younger yet, so I'd never quite experienced that time frame. Anyone, I guess, have comments, speculation on why that was?
It's an odd sort of thing. At the very least, with manga and anime and things like that, I know that a lot of it was written by women and treated as sort of like an escapism sort of thing, which is where you kept running into this stark misrepresentation. Because obviously these are women writing gay men in relationships with gay men. So there's like, and I don't know if they were straight women or not, obviously that can't quantify the whole swath of them, but it was creating this disparity of what was actually a gay man's experience and the things that they were looking to explore. And of course, the different nuances of gay men, where you have ace or demi gay men and other identities thereof that aren't really seeing themselves reflected in these things. So that's where I think a lot of it was first had attention drawn to it, because there was just that disconnect. But obviously Katie is going to have a lot more of a personal opinion on this than my very clinical research based opinion.
Well, I mean, when I rode my dinosaur to the bookstore, no, but seriously, that you've got to think back to, for me at least, the 1990s. The 1990s, everything changed. That's
I was technically
that
there.
was,
I was one.
yeah, but the 90s, you can't separate the AIDS epidemic from a lot of the transition for what happened. The 90s it was a graveyard. I mean, it was a really hard time, and then it got capped with the birth of protease inhibitors, and so much changed. Will and Grace, Ellen. I was there in this big, huge room at a bar when Ellen, the puppy dog episode. But you've got to think that at one point you couldn't go into a bookstore and buy gay literature. You went to a gay bookstore. There's still gay bookstores all across the world, but there was, you wouldn't go to Amazon. There wasn't an Amazon, but there were no places to go where it was all integrated. It was all separated. And when you went to a gay bookstore, in a lot of cases, erotica was a huge element of those places as well. It was a one-stop shopping. And I think that was just a metric of the time as well. There were no subgenres, it was one genre. If you were talking gay romance, there were very few models. Thought that was a really good comment. It was focused on the gay male experience. Absolutely. Or just the lesbian experience as well, but there was no finer shades of what that community means. I even had to learn that experience. I thought I was Mr. Diversity when I wrote this series, where there's so many queer characters, until someone said, yes, you've got a lot of gay white men. Hey, great. But look at the rest of it. And I've learned myself, and it's such a better world today. I mean, the world can be a dumpster fire. We know it. We're all worried about Twitter and what it means. Is it going to become a toxic cesspool again? But never forget, this is a different world than it was even 20 years ago. So different. That the gains we've met, there's no way we're going to lose as many as, things might be going back a step right now, but they'd have to go back 10 steps to be like what it was in the 80s and 90s, let alone before that.
Oh yeah. And of course, those steps they're taking back, they're meeting a lot of resistance. I doubt it'll last. But as far as that, like, diversity and inclusivity, to cycle back there, I think it's important to mention that those steps are important of how we get there. Just because you started with stories that were all gay white men, it kind of paved the way for more and expanding beyond that, being like, wow, I really like this extremely unlikely combination of just like exclusively white gay men in this story. I wish there was more like this. And then you can introduce that variety of things, where you have bi characters, where you have people of color you can't look at and know they're people of color, things like that. You can touch on a lot of different minorities and marginalized communities because of that foot in the door of, we had to start somewhere. If you look back on Will and Grace now, I know there are kids younger than me who look at it and go like, wow, what a gross caricature of a gay man. And it's like, but you have no idea how transformative that was for so many people, for how popular that show was. It made it so much easier to have less exaggerated gay characters
Great
in
example.
mainstream fiction.
Great example.
I do also think, kind of talking about how things came from, maybe that sense of, most gay fiction or a lot of the widely available gay fiction is erotica, to where now you have more nuance, is I do think there is a greater tendency from outside the queer community to believe that all LGBTQ identities are inherently sexual, and how it's like, okay, well, if it's about someone who is cishet, then it's not, sexual. It's just, oh, the prince kisses the princess and it's no big deal, or there's a mom and a dad. But as soon as you introduce that as there's two dads, or the prince kisses the prince, then immediately a lot of people go, oh, then why are you sexualizing this? And so I do think that there is a correlation between that idea that queer identities are inherently sexual, and you had to get your foot in the door with something erotic. And now we've realized, or queer people have taught the cishet community, that it's not inherently sexual just to be queer. That maybe that is an aspect of that for some people and not for others, just like that's an aspect for some in the cishet community and not for others. But it does shape how fiction today has more room for that nuance and more room for the hand holding and the meet cutes and things like that, where before we weren't given as much room for that.
Yeah, I think allies have played a big difference in that too. I remember I went to college with this incredibly straight jock. Like, you couldn't come up with a more stereotypical image of a jock. And he said his high school teacher once did an exercise with the class, and they said, what's the first thing that comes to your mind when you see two men walking down the street holding hands? And inevitably, most of the class said, well, they're having sex, that's immediately what you jump to. A man and a woman walking down the street holding hands, what's the first thing you think? Well, maybe they're boyfriend, girlfriend, they're falling in love, they just met. And he said that was a transformative experience for him, realizing you're JR, what you said is right. There is romance, it's not just sex. And maybe that we've evolved past then. And I do think allies in education, television, all of that have opened the door. I thought that was a really good comment as well. You have to, looking back at like Friends, for instance, when Friends came out, it was transformative too. They talked about gay people. Ross was married to a woman who married a woman, but we look back at it now and we can see the problems. It's a luxury. It is a luxury to find some of that stuff problematic. It really is.
Oh yeah. Which, I mean, not that they should be grateful for it. This should be the norm. This is the bar now. And if we become complacent, we won't get more nice things. But it's definitely like, it's a good thing to be able to step back and see the generations' experiences that came before ours, because I think that's something that I think the younger generation of the queer community also doesn't know. I mean, just people who are barely older than me, my friends' family, they have his brother is gay, and his boyfriend will tell me all kinds of things of like when they met. He was like, I had to practically sneak down the street to like get into the gay bar without being seen. And he was like, it was this whole like stealth operation. And he tells it like it's funny, but you can tell that that's like, obviously at the moment, it wasn't funny. So like, it's a completely different experience. And there isn't a gay history course in a public school in America. That's not a thing. So when you have queer romance in something like this, it helps, I think, to shed light on the struggles that came before that got us where we are now. So you have context for these things. And it shows up all over the place.
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think there is some degree, fortunate or unfortunate, there is that degree of a necessity to educate some readers as you write queer stories that maybe isn't necessarily there in other romances. That, as you're talking about this identity, someone who's reading this book may not be familiar with that identity. And there has to be some level for some people of defining that, which can be very frustrating at times that you feel like, well, why do I have to define this identity, especially if it's an identity that you as an author share? I know writing demisexual characters, I sometimes get frustrated because I'm going, I shouldn't have to explain who I am and by extension who my character is. But at the same time, I have to recognize the fact that my book may be someone's first introduction to that identity, and balance making sure that my book is engaging for someone who's familiar with or might also be demi, while also saying this is a space that if you're not sure who you are, or if you're not familiar with this identity, you can also learn more about this in fiction in a way that is more enjoyable than, you know, going online and going, okay, what does demisexual even mean? What is this? You know, you're not having to Google it, but it does kind of suck in a way because traditional romance, they don't necessarily have to define their sexuality in their writing at the same time.
Yeah, because the expectation is there. There's a guy, there's a girl on
Yeah.
the screen, girl's hot, guy's shredded. You know how it's going to go.
Exactly.
Though, you know, I'll say it is nice to see that standards are evolving so that even in that traditional romantic community, they're facing problematic material from you know, very short time frame ago, 10, 20 years. And I think as I'm sure we're going to be asking some questions in this, even on this panel, that I want to talk about some tropes that we need to bury. And that includes the traditional romance. There are tropes that need to be shot and buried. Let's be honest.
Yeah. And honestly, I'm glad that the queer romance is going to kind of like reverse affect the straight romance genre, because while it kind of sucks to have to establish these things, it also means that like even before I came out as like realized that I was demi in college, I was like, I don't know, straight romances are just boring. How do I say that? Because like when I was reading all these queer romances, they were putting in the work. They wouldn't just be like, boy, girl, kiss, yes, romance, send. It was like you had a build up to it. It's almost like the weird reverse situation where like people who aren't in the community look at two guys holding hand and be like, oh, they're at it, but that's not actually how it happens in like established good queer romances, where you have to lead up to it. You have to say, why are these people together? What do they see in each other? How do they feel about each other? Instead of coasting on the hetero expectation of a romance at the end of an action movie, you have to put in that effort and say, this is why they're a couple. Aren't they adorable? Or vaguely concerning, depending on the tone you're going for.
I think I'm going to move us on to the next question now. And this is sort of two questions wrapped into one. And that is, are there any topics you think we should steer clear of? And are there any topics you think we should see way more?
I have very strong feelings about this, especially ones that we need to steer away from. And it does amount to tropes. There are certain tropes, even in the romantic literature community, that we need to do away with. Unless your novel is specifically built around some of these things, it's time we put student-teacher relationships out to pasture. I'm tired of that being used as a romantic device. Consent issues. I am tired of lack of consent being a romantic goal. I was just watching, like, look back at, I don't know if you guys ever heard of the movie Revenge of the Nerds. There's a scene in which the guy pretends to be someone else and has sex with a young woman. That's rape.
Horrifying.
That was in the 80s. It shouldn't have even happened then. But then I just watched another movie recently where the entire point of the romantic plot was that the young man was going to say anything to get the teenage girl in bed. That's lack of consent. I mean, we need to stop that stuff. That should not be romanticized. I think we do have a duty as a writer to put some of that stuff out there. Adults and minors. I'm even sick of 300-year-old vampires and 16-year-olds. I mean, those are some things I think we need to do away with. On the flip side of it, things that I loved what you guys said, that we can be the forefront, the harbingers of bringing some of this stuff to the entire community. But the different types of connection we make, that different types of intimacy. Intimacy does not necessarily mean taking off your clothes and having sex. Intimacy is the romance. It's the getting to know the people. It's that safe harbor you build before you engage maybe in more acts of intimacy, more of that. And that's actually become a focus of my writing. I didn't hit it at first. I paid very close attention to what my readers were saying, very close attention to what they're saying. I read every review on my books because I've learned so much from it. And a lot of that does come down to how grateful people are that there can be nuanced views of relationships that don't amount to when do they have sex.
Yeah. Although I will say that even when you are like, if you have a character who's all about one night stands and has like a body count that rivals the Spartan armies, there's still a buildup there. There's still a sense of safe harbor. You still feel safe enough with this person to be physically intimate. So even when you're talking about something that's not a serious long-standing relationship and is a fling, friends with benefits, one night stand, don't know their name, never going to see him again, any of those kinds of relationships still have a measure of chemistry to them that I think is important to establish and demonstrate what a safe interaction looks like. And honestly, for me, this was a nonfiction workshop that I went to where at that point I had realized I was ace and I was just not interested. And I had a friend who was sharing all these stories of her numerous exploits. And when she found out that I was ace, she pulled me to the side afterwards and was like, "Oh my God, you must think I'm the worst person." And I was like, "Who said that to you? I will fight them. I will lose and I will fight them anyway." Like, because that to me is like, it's still a valid connection with someone, and that's not like a lesser thing in any regard. So I think having that, experiencing that through her showed me what a safe interaction looked like. And it wasn't like, oh, she's putting herself in a bad situation and it always ends in tragedy. Like, I was learning through her that there was still a safe boundary there. There was still consent. She didn't know these people closely, but they cared about her boundaries and she cared about theirs. And it was still a very healthy situation to be in despite its fleeting nature. So it's like, I think it should be more prevalent in all forms of queer romance, no matter what you're looking at, to prioritize those things in every case.
Yeah. I think the nice thing about romance in general is how much room there is for everyone across the spectrum. I know that I've read some incredible books that are about people who do have a high body count and how, that enhances their experience with romance and things like that. I think it's amazing also on the flip side that, I have a book that I'm releasing in November where it's between two asexual characters and the peak of their intimacy is a hug. That is the peak of their intimacy there in terms of physical intimacy, because that's what's comfortable for both of them. But you see that longing, you see that growing closer over time. And so seeing that there is room for a book like that in the same world that there is room for a book with someone who is much more sexually active and much more, sexually interested is just phenomenal to me. And I think that making room for both of those things is something that we do need more of in romance in general, but also especially in queer romance, that there's room for both of these identities at the table. There's room for both of these topics at the table. And these can exist in the same book, in different books, across the board.
Yes.
Yeah, showing respect for each community too. That I'm glad you said that, because while I might be more on the asexual sweet romance spectrum of my own writing, I can't slut shame. That's
Right.
Really in the gay community. Talk about don't slut shame. Everyone has their own view of the world. Some people have a really healthy view of sexuality and their own place in it. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with either side of that. If you know your audience and who you're writing for, and you do it respectfully.
Yeah.
I think it was something that,
go ahead.
Oh my goodness, we're being too polite.
Go for it.
Okay. It is something that was like, I am personally very amused right now that there's just three of us and we're all on the astemmy side of things. That was literally my whole note of like, what are the odds? They were like the perfect trifecta. Bring in the aces. And that
I was at Worldcon for the first time, and I sat on a panel on asexuality, and it was the first time they've ever done it. It was a special topic for that year because everyone who hosts, I guess they're able to pick some special topics just that that city thinks that they want to talk about. And they put us in a small room thinking no one would go, and it was standing room only. They took pictures of people lined up in the back of the room, and it changed the way they thought of it. I hear that, you know, it's very likely that an ACE panel will happen again at Worldcon because of there's so much more interest out there than you think.
We're just a quiet group. It's
Yeah.
kind of hard to notice us because we're not clubbing.
Yes, exactly.
Generally speaking, maybe we are.
I think also one thing that is important to note is, you know, as we talk about kind of identity and different aspects of queer identity, like asexuality, like aromanticism, things like that, I think one thing that I see a lot more of in queer romance that I think maybe there's room for more of is the fact that you can't separate one identity, like one aspect of someone's identity from another aspect of someone's identity. So, you know, a lot of times you do have, as you mentioned, Quillful, that, you know, you have a boy, you have a girl, and you know they're going to get together based on the way that romance formulas typically work. But I feel like there's so much more room for kind of nailing down that identity. So like I'm autistic and I'm also queer. And so the way that I interact with, I'm not queer because I'm autistic, but the way that I interact with my queerness is informed by the fact that I'm autistic, just like the way that I view my autism is potentially informed by the fact that I'm queer. So if I'm writing a character who is autistic and queer, that character's relationship with their queerness is different from maybe someone who's allistic and queer and their view of their own queerness. In the same way, you know, someone who is Black and queer is going to have kind of that different relationship with their queerness than someone who's white and queer because of their life experience and the way that they interact with that. And so I feel like I would love to see more of this, but I do think we're kind of on that pathway of saying this character is multiple identities at the same time. And these identities inform the other identities that they have. And I feel like that's not something we see a lot in mainstream romance, that I think in general, queer and, you know, traditional straight romance could really be improved with.
Oh yeah, intersectionality is becoming a big discussion all across the board, and I think that it's hard for allies to write about because it's a little daunting where they're like, I already don't know what one of these things is personally. So like, and if you do something wrong, like it's a very, I say wrong, I don't really, I mean, like you'd have to try to really mess something up, in my opinion. Like you have to go out of your way to be disrespectful about it, in which case, like, why are you writing about it in the first place? Like that's a lot of investment for something you don't respect. But if someone doesn't handle something quite well, the backlash can be quite daunting. So I think intersectionality is going to be a long ways off for ally creators, but for people within the community, it's definitely something that I can see happening in the near future. And there's a lot to it. Like, I identify as Demi, but I am also a survivor of child abuse. So you could say, well, are you Demi or is it trauma based? Okay, yeah, maybe it is. And that's something that I had to look at and go, no, I was definitely born Demi. And the trauma didn't really help that because now I play it on hard mode where it's like, I'm Demi with trust issues. You're never getting in. So, but like, you feel free to laugh too, by the way. This is fine with me. But that to me is like an important thing to mention because that was a big struggle for me for a lot of years, and seeing those hardships and those identity crises come through in fiction, I don't know who else that could speak to. You know, I'm certainly not the only victim of child abuse. I'm far from it. And I'm certainly not the only Demi victim of child abuse like that. I'm not a unicorn. So there are other people out there who have had these experiences. And if I did include something like that in fiction when I was well and ready to do so, it would come from a place of respect and understanding and painting it differently. If it was trauma based, then that would be its own thing, but it would be part of that journey. And it's important for everyone to look at their identity across the board and figure out whether this label works for them or not. And that's another important thing to include in queer romance, to know that you aren't just figuring out your relationship with this other person, you're also figuring out your relationship with yourself.
You know, we talked about like why is you know, queer romance so sexualized. I think another element ties into what you're talking about. It's much different now than it used to be, but you didn't have the protection and resources and community as a young person when I was growing up, which meant you didn't have that sweet romance phase as an adolescent. You jumped right into the pool. Like you went to places where you had to hide when you walked in. You couldn't tell people you went there. And when you're a young gay person and you don't have the protection of adults around you, you're surrounded by predators. You just are. Abuse that's a very real element of a lot of growing up experiences of a lot of gay people, because again, they just didn't have that protection. It is different now, but you are absolutely right that is simply an element of our story. It's an element of our history.
And even the ways that it's different now, they're just in danger in different ways. I mean, all these things with like that, it's not to invalidate anybody else's experience. It's just kind of like the Don't Say Gay bill as an example, where they're like, well, don't sexualize our children. I'm like, I found out I was demi when I was 7 years old because my dad's church asked us, like, so who do you think your husband should be? I was like, I'm 7. I didn't think about this. And all the other girls are like, oh, he's gonna be blonde with blue eyes. We're gonna have 2.5 kids, 3 dogs, a white fence. And I was like, oh, I did not study for this exam. Like, that was when I found out official. Like, I didn't have a word for it, obviously, but I should never have been put in that position by an adult. Like, that was a completely inappropriate question for a random adult who doesn't know me to ask me.
What advice would you give to people who are trying to write identities that aren't their own?
For me, I think a huge part of this is making sure that at most steps of the process, you have someone with those identities kind of checking in. So whether you're paying a sensitivity reader, which if you have a sensitivity reader, you absolutely should be kind of paying them for that time and labor. But also your beta readers, your co-writer, you know, anyone that you can connect with and say, I need to make sure that this identity is being written in a way that's accurate and helpful is important. And ideally, you should have more than one of those, you know, more than one set of eyes on it. And because no one person's experience is a monolith here. So what someone says, yes, you've absolutely hit the nail on the head with this representation. Someone else may say, hey, I think this potentially is triggering, or this potentially is inaccurate. And then you can kind of look and explore what is the most sensitive way to convey that identity without stepping on toes or without writing something that isn't quite sensitively covered, basically.
Yeah. And I think it's a great point with sensitivity readers that you are going to want to cover the range with it. And part of that also comes with, you cannot please every single person. You're not going to speak to every single experience. Even right now, this panel's name, Queer Romance, there are people in the LGBTQ community who don't want to be referred to as queer, as individuals. I don't think they would necessarily be off put by a broad title like this, but maybe an individual person might. And that's something that's like maneuvering things like that. It's like, we can't, every single person's experience deserves to be respected and heard. But if you try to include all of them in one, you're just going to end up cheapening the experience for literally everyone. So whatever you're doing, do it with respect and intent. And that's kind of, a sensitivity reader can guide you in that sense of like, okay, if this is inaccurate for this person, but it resonates with this person, then I need to lean in to the experience that matches up with what's resonating here.
Yes.
I think nowadays, I'm not going to lie, I hate this question because it's a minefield. It really is. I know my readers are split on it. They completely are. It's own voices is what it comes to. I mean, you know, I hate addressing this question. I'm not going to lie about it. But whether all my readers would agree or not, it comes down to this. Do I think that only people who have that life experience should write those stories? No, I don't, because there are so many books out there I love that if I hadn't had the chance to read them, it would break my heart. I think that at the very least, what we're talking about here makes sense. I didn't necessarily, I've always had a writing group and had everything workshop, but after the stumbles I made in my first book, and there are things I'm pretty embarrassed about. I wish I could go back and rewrite parts of it, especially with, you know, again, thinking that gay white men is not the whole of the world. You know, my racial diversity, how I treat women characters, all the different spectrums, even within the community. It was when I opened up my, when I suddenly got a readership and I had people who lived those stories as well and wanted to be beta readers. So writing group, beta reading, and then sensitivity reading on top of it, especially with elements such as I brought someone into my story who is in a wheelchair and really doing serious research about what does that mean? How do you be respectful without being, you know, a stereotype or reducing it to its most common tropes? It does take a lot of work before.
Oh, yes.
If you want your book to hit the bookshelf, you better have done your work up until that point, if that is not your voice, because otherwise, yeah, you're going to be held accountable.
And you go first this time.
Okay, I think that the point that you made about does someone have to share the identity with their character, and the answer being no, is really important. I know when I first started writing queer fiction, I had kind of grown up in a space where being queer wasn't okay. And as I wrote characters, I was writing identities thinking, well, this isn't my identity, but, and realized that in writing that, I had a much stronger conversation with myself about gender, about sexuality, and realized that I had a lot more in common with my characters than I thought. So what was me writing something and going, oh, I just think this would be a fun book to write, ended up being a very deep discussion with myself going, this actually does hit closer to home than I realized. This does shift my perception of my own identity. And I feel like had there been a closed door saying, you can't write this identity because you don't share it, I wouldn't have been able to realize that I did share the identities I was writing when I was writing those things. I just didn't have the framework or the language myself to know that was what was happening at the time. And so I feel like when you close that door off, you might be closing someone off from realizations that they need to have about themselves. And I think it's really important to acknowledge the way that writing can impact your own discussion with yourself on who you are.
It's a very good point. I know at least one author who did end up being like chased a little bit on social media because she was writing from an identity that they told her she did not have. And she was like, actually, in the course of writing and publishing this book, I have explored my identity, but now I am terrified to come out because the community is after me at this point. And I feel like it would seem like, you know, like fake, and they're giving her all these like identity crises. And it's like, it comes again where it's like I feel like it's hard to say it, but I feel like the intention is both like one, a traumatic experience type of like knee-jerk reaction that needs to be more controlled overall on a personal level, but also something that can be quite damaging despite what could be construed as a well-intentioned thing, where it's like, oh, if you have an autistic character, you're going to want an autistic actor or actress. Yes, obviously that would be the intention because they're physically there and they understand it on a very personal level. There's a nuance and depth to it that you wouldn't want someone depicting. It just comes off on a bad note if it's an actor or an actress. But if it's a creator, a writer, there's a whole different level there. Anything of that regard where you can do more of that research, and the research isn't always professional either. You're not going to be looking at all scholarly articles. You can roll over to TikTok if you want. They have the neurodivergent TikTok communities, and you could just watch video after video after video from people who are actually autistic from across the range of autism and see what their experiences are like and see that for yourself, so that when you do get feedback from your writing groups, from your beta readers, from your sensitivity readers, you have context. You're not completely out of your depth. So research has lots of forms, but also this is a great platform to explore these sorts of things for people who might not have done it otherwise, because it at first isn't as daunting.
Definitely.
A lot of the problems, I think, or the controversy we hear with own voices, it seems to me, this is sort of my developing opinion, problems not so much with the writing and the writers, it's with the industry, it's with the marketing, it's with access. It's not, you never forget your privilege when you're writing, never forget your privilege, always check your privilege. And what I worry about isn't so much, are people telling stories not of their own experience, but are we giving people who have had that experience the access to tell their stories? That's an evolving question. And that's something which we got to keep in the front of our minds, because the world's not going to get any better unless you confront something like that. I do think things are better than they used to be, especially in the transgender community. I think the wealth of stories we're seeing lately, especially young adult stories, it's amazing. It's really an explosion of all these great topics, but they didn't always, the transgender community didn't have access once upon a time. Sure, you could write a story about this if it wasn't your background, but what publishing house would support you and market you and promote you, if you were the face of that story? Things are getting better, but we still got a way to go. And it's an important topic to keep live.
I think on that note, it's really been interesting to see how the publishing industry as a whole has been shaped by individual writers. And, there's this kind of tendency to go, Amazon does a lot of really harmful things. But Amazon ultimately gave kind of that open door to people to publish their own stories without having to go through a publisher traditionally. And that gave room for independent and small presses to make room for those identities. I know I publish most of my books through a small press, and I think 5-10 years ago, there would not have been that access necessarily to publish as a queer author of queer fiction, something in the mainstream. But now we see queer books by queer authors coming out regularly and constantly. Every single release day, there's something now that is queer by a queer author. And it's something that I think was really the ability to self-publish and indie publish paved the way for there to even show that there was a market for that kind of thing.
Great point.
And the fact that we now know that there's a market means large presses can't ignore the fact that there's a market, which means then they have to pick up more of those stories than they ever have before.
Especially with the market evolving faster than, frankly, I think the big publishing houses are. I remember hearing a story from my writing professor where he had a limousine pick him up from his hotel to bring him to his public reading, and it was literally 2 minutes down the road, and he was like, do we need a limousine for this? I could walk. Like, these are the kinds of things that their ability to evolve and adapt and grow has to be forced, because they just literally don't look at those kinds of things. So I think it's a very important thing to mention. And of course, the gray area of things with something like Amazon, where if I could avoid it, I never order off of Amazon ever. But if I'm ordering a book from a small author and they have their stories on Amazon, then I'm buying it on Amazon. Or I go to my local bookstore and I have them order it because I'm pretentious like that. And that's an important thing to note, is that just because an overall company has practices you don't agree with, there are going to be opportunities to do some good with their terrible existence as well. So I think that was a good point to mention.
Okay, I'm going to move on to what might end up being the last question, depending on how much, I guess, meaty we get into it. What's your process to approaching difficult topics?
I would say the number one thing, we already covered touched on the idea of always going at something with respect, but I think the most important thing to mention is trigger warnings, because there's so much difficulty around right now where people are like, if you have a trigger warning, you're a snowflake. And it's like, you just don't know. You just do not know what could really, really hurt someone. And it's not that difficult to be like, content warning, absent parent. I did that for this story, which isn't romantic at all, but it's got a queer rep in it, so here we are. And that's something that I want to mention, because if you're reading this on Father's Day and you've got an absent father and it's got an absent father in it, I could seriously hurt you, not meaning to. And in order for you to be able to navigate the world online and cultivate your own experience, I need to tell you things like, hey, you might not be ready to read this. Now, if you read it anyway and you're like, you hurt my feelings, I'm like, I literally put out the like slippery floor sign and you ran at it full tilt. I don't know what you want me to do. But I think it's an important thing to mention when you're approaching a difficult topic, to say it's a smart move to put in the trigger warnings, because it's just part of approaching something with respect. Are the people experiencing it as well?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, JR.
No, go for it.
This is a very personal topic for me, because I didn't do trigger warnings or content warnings in my first 2 books until paid attention to what my readers were saying, and it really gave me an opportunity to evolve. And I mean, I don't blame people for not doing content warnings. I blame people for when the readers say you really should do content warnings, and then somehow sitting on a pedestal saying, no, this isn't for me, I'm not going to do that. I mean, sure, you can be that asshat if you want. But when you're being confronted with it and readers are serious, it's a sign of respect to reply to that. And I adopted my agent, Sarah Megabo, had just a fantastic advice, because trigger warnings evolved too, along with our idea of what really does trigger people in society. So all my trigger warnings are on my website, and I published the link to it in my dedication page. You see the link, you go to it, and I had my readers come up with the trigger warnings and the content warnings. I personally think they went a little bit too far. It's like a list of 30 things for my next book. And I look at that list and I'm like, well, what the hell? I'm not going to read this. Like some of them, I'm like, did I really endanger an animal? I don't remember, but a lot of them are incredibly insightful. I wouldn't have thought of putting it there, and it makes so much sense. And most readers will tell you it's not going to make them not want to read the story. If they like the series, it's going to get them ready. Even to the point of asking themselves, maybe I don't want to listen to this when I'm driving, if this really is going to be a topic and it's going to affect me so much. I'm a huge convert about, I will always now have content warnings on my website, and I will always link it to the dedication page going forward. I've made a promise to myself about that.
That's good. You're honestly leading by example. Like, you're the type of writer I hear about that's made a big transformation, and I'm like, I don't know if people do that in real life. And now I do. Such
a shame when you don't. I mean, evolving and paying attention to what your readers are saying and giving it to them, not pandering to your readers, not changing the nature of your story, but acknowledging what they really enjoy and showing respect for it. It's just common sense to me. It builds do you want a readership, or do you want a community around you? Do you want people who just buy your book, or do you want fans? I mean, do you want people who are excited about you writing come back because they feel like almost they're a part of the world building, they're a part of this universe that you've created? That's what I want, and the only way I'm going to get it is by paying attention to my readers.
I think the thing is using content warnings can give you the space to explore topics that you want to explore without hurting someone. I know that I had previously been told by someone, you can't have your demisexual or asexual character face trauma, because everyone's going to assume that if they face trauma in your book, that's what made them ace or demi. And so when I had my book, which is the one here, Getting Off, I have a character face trauma. And it was kind of a lack of consent situation. And I wanted to make it clear that this does happen. It is there in the story, this existence of this. There is kind of positive therapy representation and everything. But for me, I didn't feel like I could ethically explore those conversations without warning someone that difficult topics were in there. To the point that positive representation of therapy is one of the content warnings that I list for my books that include that, because I know a lot of people have trauma from negative experiences with therapy. And so for me, I feel like using those warnings is a way that gives you space to explore those topics without fear that you're going to hurt someone. Because if they are going, this is something I absolutely cannot read, they have the room to stay away from that book. Or if they're saying, I can read this, but I need to be informed up front, they have that room to go into that story knowing this is what's happening. And it kind of gives you more room to explore difficult topics than if you don't have those content warnings there.
Agreed.
Nice way of phrasing it.
And I think that's a big part of approaching difficult topics in general, of just like knowing what you're approaching and why. And content warnings also kind of make you think more about the why of like, why am I doing this? You were told not to do that by someone who is well-meaning but not necessarily quite on the mark, where it's like, yes, there is that possibility to speculate, but it's not like Ace and Demi people never experience any trauma and they're just like live in a perfect little bubble and nothing bad ever happens to them. I probably should say us. Here we are. And being able to communicate these things and show that vulnerability is important in fiction, because when you come across a news story, you can get people defensive. If you're talking about real versus fake people, sometimes people get their guard up with someone who is real and they're going to go into, oh, you know, victim blaming, victim shaming, all those horrible things we'd never want to see. But if you have a fictional situation and you've got this character you've established that everybody likes, something bad happens to them, it sheds a completely different light on it, in the sense that they've already connected to this person. This isn't a faceless individual that they heard in a story and go like, well, they shouldn't have been there, something token and awful like that. You get, oh, this is awful, this wasn't even their fault. And writing something like that, your perspective of acknowledging that this isn't that person's fault is something that really shows through without having to be directly said. But obviously having those content warnings in place makes it so that everyone goes in knowing that's going to happen. You know what your intent is sharing that story and what you're trying to approach truly at the core of it, because there are a lot of reasons that you might mention something traumatic or difficult happening, and being able to know what those reasons are helps you depict that better and connect with your readership over it, whether they're in the community or allies of the community. There's that connection there.
I think that's very good. I think that's some very useful things and important things. Before we end, I'm going to briefly give you all an opportunity to, I guess, quite quickly talk about projects you've got coming up, that kind of thing. And then we can sign off.
Once again, I'm Katie Edwards. My urban fantasy series, which is very queer friendly and very found family and hopefully very funny, is called The Tarot Sequence. My third book came out in May, and it is a planned 9-book series. So I'm very excited to see what comes next for me. And I have really enjoyed this opportunity. It's been a fantastic conversation. For readers who want to connect with me, my website is katie-edwards.com or Katie Edwards _NC on Twitter, which for the moment, at least, is where I am largely based on social media.
Well, I have this November a project called The Heartbreak Handshake, which is a novella that includes fake dating and asexuality and kind of that realm of, my mom wants me to date someone, it may as well be you. I also have an upcoming gay male romance called Hart on His Lead coming up later this year. And I am J.R. Hart author everywhere on social media. You can find me at jrhartauthor.com. And thank you very much for this opportunity.
And I am actually a Patreon writer, so I just go by Quillful. And the more patrons I get, the faster I share stories. Right now, I go on a seasonal basis because I have a lot of projects that I work on. So for the short stories and the different perks that I have, I can really only go on a 4 times a year schedule. But I've already got another patron this year, and opportunities like this one have been helping me grow my patron base and my fan base, my community, as Katie put it, because I am all here for that. I love the community energy. So I have been working on different projects. Right now, I'm going to be releasing a chapter 2 of Where Ages Meet this spring. So by the end of May, and that's just a fantasy coming of age story with 2 gay protagonists. We don't know that they're gay in the story yet, but I like to sneak it in there at the last second till it's too late for readers to leave. So that is that.
Excellent. Thank you all. I hope you've had a good time.